Azure storage is incredibly cheap. For just pennies a month, you can store gigabytes of data in the cloud. In this video, I'm going to show you how to set up an Azure storage account and then how to utilize it in your applications. We will upload and download data securely using C#. Now, software development is difficult. I work to make it easier. On this channel, I have over 700 videos dedicated to C#, Azure, SQL, and other technologies that would help a .NET developer. I also have a podcast called Dev Questions that focuses on answering the important questions you have as a developer. And finally, on IamTimCorey.com, I provide training courses that help you become or improve as a software developer quickly. If you work for an organization and have a Visual Studio subscription, also check out my.visualstudio.com for a major discount to the Dev Pass. Not only will it give you all of my training courses for one low fee, but it will also allow your manager to assign courses, track progress, and more. All right, so let's jump into this video on Azure storage. And by the way, I do have a full course on Azure and how to use Azure safely, effectively, and without breaking the bank. Okay, so first, let's talk about not breaking the bank. Let's talk about making sure that we're not spending a lot of money that we can't afford, especially when we're testing things out. Now, if you just signed up for Azure, well, then you get, I believe it's $200 in free credits, but you also get a year of certain services for free as well. Azure storage will be one of those items you get for a year for free. But let's just pretend like you don't have any of that and you are going to have to pay for Azure storage. Now, there are local simulators for Azure storage you can use instead that are free, but we're going to use actual Azure storage. And when you think about using any service in the cloud, you might think, well, that should be free. But when you talk about scale and how many people are going to use it, that's an expense. That's a huge expense. And so Microsoft has to balance how much they give away for free versus how much they charge you something for. Azure storage is one of those things where if you pay for it, you're not going to pay much for it unless you are really using a lot. So let's click on, this is the Azure pricing calculator. Let's click on storage accounts. We add that. And if you notice out of the gate, it's going to cost you, based upon this configuration, $21.84 a month. But that's not really what you should be paying. So let's talk about how you can configure this. First of all, let's look at the information here at the top. Region, East US, that's fine unless you are in Europe or United Kingdom or somewhere else where the pricing may be a bit different. But if you're in the US, pretty much all US pricing will be about the same, if not the same. Now, we're going to use block blob storage. Okay, so there's table storage, queue storage, data lake, Azure files, and these will have different pricing, but we're just going to use the block blob storage. The performance, we're going to set standard. Premium, as you might guess, costs more. And we're going to use the general purpose V2 storage account type. Okay, and we're going to use a flat namespace. Now, if you use a hierarchical namespace, that will cost more. Flat is fine. You don't need to have a full file structure on the web. You just need a place to store your files. And yes, you can put them into folders, just not nesting deeply. Okay, access tier is hot. So the difference between the different tiers here is that really the cool, cold, and archive are meant to be more for putting data in, not getting it out very often. So think of it like backup locations or long-term storage of files that you don't need to access very often, those type of things. But for us, we're going to expect that we're going to put files in often and take files out a lot, or not take files out, but download files, get copies of those files quite often. So we're going to use the hot tier. Now for redundancy, we're just going to use the locally redundant, so LRS. What that means is it's going to be redundant just inside of a particular data center, I believe, not sending it to multiple data centers and replicating it. As you can imagine, if you send it to multiple data centers, you're going to pay more money. So, okay, let's look at the big price difference here, the big reason why this scary $20 a month is showing up. And that's because by default, this calculator estimates you're going to store 1,000 gigabytes of data, otherwise known as 1 terabyte of information in the cloud. That's a lot of data. Now, for us, we're not going to do nearly that much. So let's change this to 1 gigabyte for now. And if you notice, we're down to 2 cents a month. Now, the total bill is still $1.06, but let's talk about why. Let's come back up here, and this is why a calculator is great. Now, we're going to be basing this off of how much we actually use. So if you use less than a gigabyte, you're getting even less charges. This is just an estimator based upon what you think you might use. So if you say, you know what, I'm going to use 10, okay, now you're at 21 cents for your capacity, okay? So it's based upon how much you use, not just upon what you put in this calculator. Okay, now, right now it's saying that we're going to have 100,000 write operations per month. We pay 5 cents per 10,000. Well, if this is a demo site where we're trying things out and testing things out, we don't need 100,000. We could get by with 10,000 without a problem. And the same thing for the list and create container operations. We can get by with just 10,000 of those. Because again, listing the container and creating the containers, that's going to be done a few times a month at most. We shouldn't be doing that a lot. Writing operations, that's if we upload files to it a lot. Well, more than 10,000 files being uploaded to the server, that's a lot. But even so, every 10,000 files is just 5 cents. Now, when it comes to read operations, it's expecting 100,000 read operations at 0.4 cents per 10,000 operations. Okay, so this is saying that we're going to expect 4 cents total because 10 times 10,000 operations. But again, if we're only reading 10,000 files, again, 10,000 is a lot. So then we're going to charge 1 penny. And all our operations, data retrieval is 1 terabyte, doesn't really matter. Data write doesn't matter. So our monthly upfront cost, if we use it at a reasonable rate, is going to be 13 cents a month. Okay, and that's because we're doing 10,000 lists and create and 10,000 writes. So that's not exactly breaking the bank, I wouldn't assume, for anybody that's trying to learn software development, especially if you don't use the whole month. If you're testing for 2 weeks, well, then your bill's getting half. So even though it is a charge after the first year, remember you get the first year of Azure Storage for free, but after the first year, you'll be paying about 13 cents for your container unless you store more than 1 gigabyte in the container or unless you do a whole lot more write and list operations or a ton of read operations. But again, if we aside 5 gigabytes, now our total bill is 23 cents per month. So again, for 6 gigabytes, let's down to 5 because 5. For 5 gigabytes of data in the cloud for a month is 21 cents. If you extrapolate that out for a year, you're talking about $2.60 roughly for the entire year of usage. That's not a lot of money. Okay, so but that's what we're going to do. We're going to configure it this way and save as much money as possible. And again, the capacity, we don't tell Azure this is how much I'm going to use. It just checks how much we're using. So especially in development, we're not going to be using a whole lot of memory. So therefore, we can safely say 1 gigabyte. Okay, so that's the calculator. Let's actually create our Azure storage account. So we're going to create a resource. We're going to come down here to storage and say storage account create. This is going to ask us a few questions. Let's start the resource group. Always create a new resource group name unless you know for certain you want to join another one. But we're going to call this our Azure Storage Demo. And what that'll do is it will link everything together that we create into this one resource group. So when we're done, we can delete the resource group and make sure that everything gets deleted all at once. Now, a storage account name, let's call this Azure Storage Demo. And let's see if it's been used. No dashes. And it's already been used. So let's go with YouTube Azure storage demo. How about that? And it appears to be correct. It appears to be usable. So we're going to deploy this in the central US. It depends where you want to deploy it, but that's what we're going to choose. Again, my calculator was based on East US, but the central US has the same pricing as East US. Okay, primary service, we're going to use Azure Blob Storage. And we're going to choose a standard tier. And we're going to choose, here's the tricky bit, not geo-redundant storage. We want local redundant storage that's cheaper. Okay, now, again, you have to think about if you're using this in production, you might want geo-redundant storage because of the safety factor that goes into it. This is for a demo, and so we're cutting down as much as possible on the pricing. The Azure course goes into these different options and how to choose and how to make sure that you protect your organization about cost overruns and security and all the rest. We're just going to create a demo here. So we hit next. And the one thing I'm going to change here, just so we can show off how to do it, is enable anonymous access on individual containers. Now, by default, we're not going to have anonymous access on containers, but I'm going to show you how to turn that on and how to access files directly. So besides that, we're going to leave this alone. We're not going to enable SFTP. You might think, well, I kind of want to have SFTP on, so I'm going to check that box. Well, if you come back over here to the this calculator and come down here and say enable SFTP for a storage account, watch the 13 cents. It now goes to $219.13. Okay. Now, that's based upon 730 hours at 30 cents an hour. We wouldn't be doing that much, but just note you're going to incur more costs, significantly more costs, by enabling SFTP. We don't need to do that. Okay, we are going to use the hot tier. So notice that it specifies cool versus cold and what those might be. We are enabling large file shares. These are all defaults. So networking we'll leave alone. We'll leave the data protection alone as well. We're not going to modify that. We're going to leave encryption alone. We're going to not bring our own keys. We're going to let Microsoft manage our keys. This support for customer managed keys cannot be changed after the storage account is created. So make sure that if you are going to manage your own keys, that you change this before you create the storage account. Otherwise, it's too late. You have to recreate your storage account, which isn't hard, but just note that. No tags. So we're going to go to review and create. We're going to create this storage account. Okay. So this will create for us our very cheap storage account that we can utilize to store files and to provide files for download access. Now, we're going to then create a C# application that will allow us to upload files to this and download files from it securely. So we'll create that next. But just note that these storage accounts are really useful for cloud operations. For example, if you've ever got source code from me, you'll notice in any video where I create source code, there's a link in the description to get emailed source code that comes from Azure Storage. And all those source code files are in Azure Storage protected, but then I send them to you via email. So that's all in Azure Storage. It makes it really simple and powerful to do, and it's really easy for me to upload new files quickly. So Azure Storage is really useful for C# developers. So let's go to resource. I'm going to go ahead and pin this to my demos dashboard. Now notice up here, one thing that's a little weird is it says dashboard and then it says YouTube Azure Storage demo _ big number overview. If you go back to your dashboard and then click on the one you just pinned there, it's a little cleaner. It's not a big deal, but just note that that's why I like pinning it and going back to it because of the cleaner URL or cleaner link there. Okay, so this explains what our Azure Storage setup is. It's a locally redundant storage. It's storage v2 general purpose, and when it was created, the subscription ID, and more. Okay, if we go to containers here, we'll see we only have a $logs container. That's one that's created automatically, but there's no other containers. We're not going to create one here. Okay, I'm going to show you how to create one via code instead. All right. Now, just to be clear, I am going to delete this after we're done. So don't worry if you see a key or something else that you might think, oh no, Tim's giving away his keys. I'm going to delete this whole thing when we're done, so it's not going to be a problem. Okay, speaking of which, down here under security and networking, there's access keys. And this gives you information on your storage account that you will need for your C# application. You have your storage account name, which is right here. You can hit copy. And then you have your key and your connection string. Both of these are valuable for accessing your storage account and getting the data you need. So we're going to use all three of these pieces of information in order to get the information we need for C#. So we'll come back to this in just a minute. Now, before I go, I do want to point out one thing, and that is Azure Storage is a whole lot more than what I'm showing off here. I'm just showing off blob storage in Azure Storage, which goes in containers. There's also file shares, queues, tables, and more. There's a lot of different ways to configure it. You can use like Azure Front Door, and in CDNs, you can do encryption. There's a whole bunch of stuff you can do with your Azure Storage, but I'm just showing the basics of it so you can get started with Azure Storage. So let's go over to Visual Studio, and we're going to create a new project. And I'm going to create an ASP.NET Core MVC project. So I could search for it over here, but I have it over here. I created it recently. ASP.NET Core MVC or web app with model view controller. All right, so we're going to choose that one. Why MVC? Because I haven't done MVC in a while. That's the only real reason. This will work with Blazor Server. It will not work with Blazor Web App unless you put an API behind it because of the security issues with fully client-side code. But you can use it with Blazor Server or use an API and use it with Blazor WebAssembly as well. You can use it with Razor Pages. You can use it with WinForms, console apps. Doesn't really matter. You can do it with any of those, and this code will work. But we're going to do it with MVC just to kind of show off MVC. Okay, so this is the storage demo and storage demo app. We're going to use .NET 9, no authentication. Yes, you'd want authentication for accessing anything secure or putting files in the cloud. We're not going to focus on that in this video. Yes, HTTPS, no container. We're going to leave all the rest alone, and we're going to hit create. And once we're done, we've got an MVC application that's pretty standard, right? There's nothing crazy about it. We have a home controller. We have a home view with index and privacy. We have the shared view for layout, error page, and more. We're going to just modify the home controller and the index view. So we're not going to go crazy and try and redo this whole application. But first, let's go to appsettings.json. And here, we're going to create a new section. We're going to call this Azure Blob Storage. And in here, we're going to have 4 pieces of information. Connection string. We're going to have the container name. We're going to have storage account name. And we're going to have storage account key. Now, these come from our page right here. Most of them do. They come from here, where we have our storage account name, we have our key, and our connection string. And the last one is container name, which we create. That container name, just so we're clear, is up here in containers. We can add a new container. Well, that's the name of the container is going to be whatever we specify in that field right here. Now, I'm not going to put any data in appsettings.json. I'm going to leave those blank because you do not want to put anything sensitive inside of appsettings.json because that gets committed to your source control. That's not where you want to put it. For local development, which is what we're doing right now, I'm going to put it in secrets.json. So I copy this section. I'm going to right-click on my project and say Manage User Secrets. And I'm going to paste it here. And this is where I'll put my secure data. This is secured on my local machine. So only my account has access to it. And it does not get put in source control. So this is secure for me. Like it's secured for my profile only. Okay, so now what I'll do, and by the way, if you don't understand app settings can get overwritten multiple times by multiple different systems, including Key Vault, including Azure, web app, environment variables, and so many other places. And you'd use those places to override these settings. This secrets.json is only for local development. So let's come over here to our right down here, access keys. We're going to grab I'm going to dry this off the screen after I'm done. I'm going to copy this one, and then I'm going to copy these two after hitting show. I'm not going to show it to you. It doesn't really matter. I'll show it to you. So I'm going to paste in the storage account name. That's right here. Then I come back over here and go to key. I'm going to copy that. And I'm going to paste that in here. Again, I'm going to delete this. So, whoops, that wasn't right. Let's do it again. Key, copy to clipboard. And then paste that. There we go. Again, that's going to go away as soon as I delete this app. So connection string, I'm going to copy that as well. Oops, copy that as well. And then paste that in here. And again, the last thing is container name, which we're going to give this a whatever name you want. So demo container is fine. Okay, now save that and close this and never go back to it because that's now my local settings. Okay, so with that, we now have our information in our Azure for the secure information we need to connect to our Azure Blob Storage from C#. Now what we need to do is we need to start setting up talking to Azure. So we need to first grab our dependency, so NuGet package. We're going to come over here and search for azure.storage.blobs. Select this and install our NuGet package for talking to blob storage. And I do really appreciate, I like to call out when I appreciate something Microsoft does. This stuff used to kind of built in a .NET framework, and they tried to put everything in .NET framework, and now they've split everything out in sort of NuGet packages instead, which means they can be separately versioned, and we don't have to have the ability to talk to blob storage if we're not using blob storage. So it really cuts down on how much is in our applications by default. Really appreciate that. Okay, so now that we have that in place, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new folder here. Let's call this options and then blob storage options. Okay, and in blob storage options, what we're going to do is we're going to basically create a POCO object, or plain old CLR object, that's just 4 properties. And those properties match up with what's in appsettings.json or secrets.json. So prop, a nullable string that is connection string. We're going to match these names. A nullable string that is container name. A nullable string that is storage account key. And a nullable string that is storage account name. And yes, you need to match those names up with what is in your appsettings.json. So make sure these there's not a typo in one of these or in your property names. So now we have the options in place. We can go over to program.cs. And in here, we can actually load those options into dependency injection. So up here where it says services add controls of views, we're going to say builder.services.add options. And this is the options pattern. If you're not familiar, I've got a 10-minute training video I just did that covers how to use the options pattern in C# to load these settings in. So blob storage options, which adds a using directive up top. And we're going to say on the new line .bind configuration, we're going to bind that to Azure Blob Storage. And that corresponds to app settings Azure Blob Storage, Azure Blob Storage. Okay, that's how it lines those up. Okay, so now we have an options in place. What we're going to do is, I'm going to do this in the MVC project. Normally, I'd split this code out into a separate class library, but I'm going to, in the main project, I'm going to create a data access folder and put blob storage. CS. Normally, I'd split it out because of the fact that I like to have my my business logic and my data access logic in a class library. It makes it much easier to upgrade from one project type, one UI type to another, etc. So in case you're not familiar, MVC is a UI framework, as in it's not the views are not the UI and the controller is the business logic. That's not how it works. The whole MVC, the models, the views, and the controllers are all UI. And so the whole project type is the UI project type. And so I try and keep things separate from the UI projects, that we can change out the UI project separate from your class library. So just so we're on the same page there. So what I'm going to do here in blob storage is I'm going to first create a constructor. And I'm going to ask for an I options of type blob storage options. And that add the two using directives I need. We'll call it blob storage. And then here we're going to create a private read-only blob storage options called blob storage. And then we'll say that blob storage equals blob storage, like so. Okay, so that's whoops, it's an I options, isn't it? Nope, dot value, that's what it is. There we go. You have to bring the value of blob storage because it's an I options. Therefore, we need the value of that if we're going to grab just that model. So that is the setup for our class. So now we have access to those options. And those options, again, are just the connection string information and other information we need for blob storage. So let's create two methods. We're going to create the first method is going to be public async task of type string that is upload file async. And we're going to take in iForm file called file. So what we're going to do is this method is going to take in iForm file and it's going to upload it to Azure storage. Now, where does the iForm file come from? Well, from the MVC's UI, where we're going to ask for the user to click on a button and it's going to pull a file picker. They're going to pick the right file and we're going to upload that file. So when they click the file picker and then say upload, that file picker is going to send us an iForm file, which we then take from here and upload. So first up, we're going to say blob container client, and that's from the Azure Storage Blobs NuGet package. And we're going to call this container client equals new, and we're going to put it on a new line here since it's going to take up a little bit of space. We're going to say blob storage dot connection string, and then there we go. On this next line, we're going to say blob storage dot container name. Those are two things it needs. It needs a connection string, which says, here's how to connect to our specific blob storage. And then here's a container name. You might say, well, Tim, we made up a container name, which we just picked. Actually, it's over in secrets. We picked a name at random. That's okay, because we're going to create that if it doesn't exist. So if it exists, cool. If it doesn't exist, we're going to create it. And that's what we're going to do right now. So await container client dot create if not exists async. So if that container does not exist, which it doesn't right now, no problem, go ahead and create it. If it does exist, we're good, leave it alone. Next up, I'm going to make sure I set the security policy on that container. Await container client dot set access policy async. And I'll do this on a new line. I'll bring it down here so you can actually see it because it auto-filled for me. So what this is doing is I'm saying set the policy, it's a security policy. So the security policy for this container to be no public access. Okay, so this is the access type. And if you come back here and say dot, you can say, well, you can access blobs, you can access the container, you can access nothing. We want nothing. I'll show you how to change that later if you want access to the blobs or the blob container. I believe if you access the blobs, then if you have a blobs URL, then you can just download that blob. And if you have this set to container, I believe you can list all the blobs in a container. But we're going to set to none. You have no access to the files in this blob storage. All right, and that's actually okay because we don't want just random people downloading directly. We don't want people hot linking to our Azure storage. I'll show you how to give them the files without giving them access to the files, if that makes sense. I'm going to make it make sense later. So next up, we're going to do is we're going to say blob client. Again, this comes from our Azure Storage NuGet package. Blob client equals container client dot get blob client, and we're going to say file dot file name. Now, where does that come from? We're passing in this iForm file, and one of the options on there is the file name for it. This is where you might want to make a change. Now, right now, what I'm going to allow the users to do is to give me a file and allow them to have named the file, which sounds fine until you think about it. Because what happens if we're uploading to the same storage location for multiple users, and user one gives me a picture called profilepic.jpg, and that's their profile picture. But then I give you the same, a different file, but it's also called profilepic.jpg, and it's my profile picture. Well, the second one would overwrite the first one, or we would not upload the second one because we said don't allow overwriting. That's a problem, which is where you might want to rename the files. So you have the original file name. Maybe what you do is you name it the username of the person who's uploading underscore in their file name. That way, it's only ever going to be per user. And then if the user uploads a new file with the same file name, then it would overwrite theirs, but it's just them overwriting their own as opposed to them overwriting somebody else's. Or maybe you create a GUID and have the same extension. So if I upload a .jpg file that's like profile picture.jpg, it's now a GUID.jpg, and that way it's unique in the container. Either way, you probably have to keep track of those things so that you don't lose these files. If you rename a file, then you have to make sure you let the user know what the new file name is so you can keep track of it. But for us, we're just going to leave the file name alone. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to say await using var stream equals file open read stream. And what this does is it opens the file and reads it into this stream variable. But I'm using a using directive. It's actually await the using directive because this is going to be an asynchronous call. So what I'm doing here is this stream will close when this curly brace closes. Okay, that's what the using directive allows for, is it allows for, using statement. The using statement allows us to close this out and dispose of it properly when we get to the end of the curly brace. So next up, I'm going to say await blob client dot upload async the stream, and then here is our, do you want to allow it to be overwritten or not? Okay, so overwrite true or false, we pass in true, meaning yes, go ahead and overwrite that file, or false, don't overwrite that file. And then return blob client dot URI dot toString. All right, so what it's going to do is going to give us the the URL to the blob client. You may ask the question, Tim, it says URI, not URL. If you're not familiar, URIs are a superset of URLs. A URI is a Uniform Resource Indicator, and a URL is your Universal Resource Locator. Slightly different. You can use URLs are URIs, but not all URIs are URLs. Yeah, I know it's confusing. Don't worry about that. So just know that's going to return a URL for us, and we're good. So it's going to return a string that is the URL of the uploaded file. Next up, what we're going to do is we're going to create one more method, and that's going to be the download file async. So public async task file content result. Okay, it's an MVC thing. If you were to be using this as an API, you might use an iResult instead, but we're going to use file content result since it's an MVC application. We're going to say download file async and pass in the URL. So if you note here, we're getting a URL, and now this one takes a URL. So we can upload it and then actually download that same file just to verify. So in here, what we can say is URI. Remember, URI is a superset. So again, Uniform Resource Identifier. Identifier, not indicator. So we're going to say blob URI equals new URL. Okay, so it creates a new URI. It passes in the URL, and that creates our blob URI. So now what we need is storage shared key credentials equals new, and I'll put this on a new line, blob storage dot storage account name, and blob storage dot storage account key. Again, those are the other two values we have in our secrets.json file. And then blob client, we're going to call this blob client, equals new blob URI and credentials. So what this does, it says, hey, I want this blob, this specific blob. I have a URL for it, or URI for it. And here's my credentials, which is the storage account name and the storage account key. And that gives me back the blob client itself. So from here, what we're going to do is we're going to say var download response equals await blob client dot download streaming async. Okay, so this is going to download the streaming results from that blob client. And that gives us now a blob download streaming result, a nullable version of that, which comes from, again, our NuGet package. We're going to say using var memory stream equals new memory stream. So, oops. There we go. New memory stream. And from there, what we're going to do is we're going to await download response dot value dot content dot copy to async and the memory stream. Okay, so again, this is a using statement, which means it's going to successfully close out of this variable properly, dispose of it properly at the end of this curly brace. And now we're going to copy the content here. So we're going to copy this to our memory stream. We're going to set the memory stream dot position to 0, or the beginning of the memory stream. So we're going to copy the file down into a memory stream, and we're going to make sure we put the pointer of that, the position of the memory stream, back at 0, so you can then replay that stream, which we're going to do here by saying return new file content result, and we're going to say memory stream dot to array. and then the download response dot value dot details dot content type, like so. So make sure you get the right content type for our file, and then the file download name equals blob URI dot segments dot last. Now, the download file name, this is where we might actually say, hey, you know what? Let's rename it back to the original file name. So if you're storing the information about this uploaded file, you can rename it as a GUID so you don't have an overwrite problem, but then store the original name in your database along with a GUID location. And then they ask for that GUID location. You download it, but then you get the original name and actually name that file based on the original name, and the user never knows that you renamed their file. Okay, so, but that's it. That's how you get the data back out when it's protected. Because again, if it's protected, you can't just put the URL in the browser and have a download happen. Now, if you don't have it protected, or if you allow for the storage account access instead of none of blob, well, then you just need the URL. You're good to go. But because the access type is none, we have to go through and pass in the storage account name and key. There's other ways of going about this. There's other options for how to get the data out. You can use let's call it a SAS token, shared access token. Basically, you can put a timer on, hey, you can have access to this particular file for this amount of time, and here's the full URL for that with this token. We're not going to do that. We're just going to use these credentials because the user doesn't have access to those credentials. This is on the server side, which is also why you cannot use this in Blazor WebAssembly directly, because the account name and account key, more importantly, would be exposed to the user. You can't do that. That's why you need to use an API instead to do all the work on the server side and protect your account key as well as your connection string. Those things are really important to protect. Okay, so now that code is written. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this into our dependency injection, which means first I'm going to create a interface for this. And it's just the interface is based upon the two methods we have in there. The reason I create the interface is not to create an interface for everything. If you're just creating interfaces to create interfaces, you're doing it wrong. But what I am doing is I am opening up the possibility of us doing things like testing and like unit testing and integration testing and so on, using this interface as opposed to having it directly tied to blob storage and having to override that. So just note that's why I'm doing it. But over here in program.cs, what we're going to do is come down here to builder.services, and we're going to say builder.services.add, let's do a singleton of blob storage and say blob storage. Now, why singleton versus scoped versus transient? Well, we're not actually storing anything here except for options, which again are also singleton because we're using I options. Therefore, we're matching that up and not using any more memory than we need to on our server. There's no reason to have it be scoped. We're not doing anything different per user, etc. So now this is in dependency injection. Now we can start using it. Now, next up, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new model that we'll use for our index page. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this just index model. So we could call it index view model. We could call it, whatever. We're just going to call it index model. Keep it simple. We're going to do a file scope namespace, and we're going to put two values in here. First one is a nullable string that will be file URL. And that's going to be what we're going to populate with the URL we get when we upload a file. And we're also going to have not a principal policy, a list of string that's going to be page errors. And I know I could put this in the view bag or something else. I'm going to use an actual model for this. It's my preference. I prefer to avoid using the view bag as much as possible. Otherwise, you start abusing it. Let's get rid of that using directive. We don't need it. Okay, so that's our index model. Now what we're going to do is create our controller, which we already have a controller called home controller. We're just going to modify this slightly to utilize, actually, you know what? We're not actually passing the logger in. Let's get rid of the logger. There's no reason to have it. We're not using it, and it just simplifies things. We can ignore this stuff down here. That's just for the other pages we're not going to be using. We're just going to concentrate on the constructor and the index action and create a couple more actions. So we're going to ask for the iBlob storage, which adds that using directive. And we're going to say blobs. And I hit control dot here and create and assign a field blobs. It used to be that my naming convention would apply. It doesn't anymore for some reason. I hit control dot to rename that. I prefer the underscore, which is standard for these. But for whatever reason, it's not applying properly anymore. It used to. So I just rename it. So there we go. So now we have our iBlob storage that's available. That's what accesses blob storage. So now what we can do is we can return our view. We're going to do one more thing to our view. We're going to say new index model, like so, which returns an empty index model for our page. That's just because we're going to start using that index model on the page, and I'm modifying this to pass in that model. Okay, now I want to have two different methods that are HTTP posts. So these are methods that we're going to call with our buttons. So first up is public async task of I action results. And that is upload file, the I form file. And then inside of here, we're going to do, oops, there we go. What we're going to do is we're going to create an index model. We'll call this model equals new. All right. And then we're going to start doing a quick check if file equals null. I need to name this file. There we go. If file is null, and it's lowercase, there we go. If file is null or file.length equals 0, okay. That's one way of doing it. That's the old way of doing it. We can change this if you want to make it a little bit more concise. So let me just copy this line here. I'm going to comment it out. This is the common way you'll see it, and you'll probably do because it is readable. We can also say if file question mark dot length is greater than 0, and then put the not in front of it. Actually, no. We would need to wrap this in like so, or put a not in front of that. Gets a little kludgy, trying to combine it all at once. So I still use this. There are other ways of going about it, but this is readable if it's null or if the length is 0. So either way, we've got is a file that has a problem. So model.pageerrors.add file missing. Please upload a file. And then we want to return the view, index, and the model. Okay, so this time what's going to happen is we're short-circuiting, because if we have an error, we're just going to say, no, we're done, so return. But we're going to return the same view, but now with this model instead of with the empty model. So we're going to return the same view, but this time with a model that includes page errors. Okay, and then if we don't have an error, we're going to say is string blob URI equals await blobs dot upload file async. Pass that file in, and that's done. So now we can say index model. Model dot file URL equals blob URI. and return view the index and index the model. Okay, so this way what's going to happen is we upload the file. If we don't provide a file that short circuits and says, hey, that's a problem. But if it does work, then we say, okay, upload the file, get the file name, the URL for it, and then return the index with that model, not with any errors, because the errors only get added if we're short circuiting, but return with the URL that was provided by the upload process. So that's all we do for upload. Now for the download process, we do another HTTP post. And we're going to say public async. Let's scroll down here a bit. Public async task of I action result. Get file. String file URL. Okay, so first off, we're going to say index model equals new. And then if string.is null or empty, file URL. And actually, we can say is null or white space. That also covers, they give us a blank. Is it white space? No, it is. Capital S. That way they give us a blank file URL, but it has spaces in it, just spaces. Well, it's still invalid. So model.pageErrors.add file or URL missing. Please provide a file URL. And then from here, we're going to return the view index, and we're going to return model. So that's, again, short circuiting if we don't get valid information. We're doing some basic error checking here. So now if we do have a correct URL, or at least some URL, then we're going to say var blob equals await blobs.download file async file URL and return blob. There we go. So now that's going to return the blob, which you notice up here we return a view with the index and the model. We don't do that when we're downloading because we're actually returning the file, which is going to start downloading immediately. So that's kind of the difference there. So we're almost ready to start testing this. Let's do one last thing, which is to modify our view. Let's go home, index, and here's where we need to make some modifications. So we're going to first say model is the index model. Whoops. I had the wrong key. Sorry about that. Minimize everything. Index model. There we go. And now we're going to say in here, instead of welcome, we're going to say upload demo, and we'll get rid of this line. If you hold down Shift and hit delete, it deletes the whole line. It does put it on the clipboard for you, so you can paste it somewhere else, like so. But just know that Shift delete does delete the whole line, but it does mess up your clipboard history in case you were careful about that. So if model.pageErrors $.count is greater than 0. So what this does is it checks to see if there are errors and how many there are. If there's more than 0, then we're going to create an unordered list. We'll create a class for that is text-danger. That's the red text typically. And do a for each and say for each ERR in model.pageErrors. Now those are just strings. So for each one, we're going to say list item, and we're going to say at ERR. Just 2 R's. Okay, so that gives us a list of all the errors, just in case there's more than one. But for us, we can only ever have one. That's okay. We're prepared for the future. All right. So now what we're going to do is display the URL if there is one. If not string is null or white space, model.file URL. Then what we're going to do here is we're going to say, let's do a paragraph tag is fine. Uploaded file URL and say at model.file URL. Okay, so it's going to display the file name just on the page. If we have uploaded a file and we want or want to show off that URL. So next up, what we're going to do is say H2, we'll say upload file. This is our upload file section. And we're going to add a form. Method is post. And we're going to say that the type is going to be multi-part form data. And then the controller is home. And then the action is going to be, this is the upload file. So there we go. I'm going to close that out. Yes, it's a little long. So let's go ahead and put this on multiple lines so it's not driving us crazy. There we go. Okay, so inside of here, what we're going to do is we're going to create our input, which is type equals file. And we'll say name equals file is fine. And class, this is for our bootstrap styling, form control, and a margin bottom of 3. Bootstrap's pretty awesome. Self-close that. And then a button, type equals submit. And then the class equals btn, and btn-primary is fine. Let's do a margin bottom of 3 on that as well. And we're going to say upload. Okay, so that's our form for uploading files. Now we're going to say h2 retrieve file. And here we're going to do another form. Method equals post. And action ASP-action equals get file. There we go. And the ASP-controller equals home. And then inside of here, we're going to say label for equals file URL and class equals form label. And we're going to call this file URL : and then next line down, we're going to say input type equals text. And if you get lost on the HTML of this, HTML has changed over the years, but basically this is just straight HTML with a little bit of bootstrap styling in the class names, so it makes it look a little nicer. If you have the Dev Pass, I have a full course on Web Development Master Course. It goes through all of this stuff, and then Bootstrap course as well that goes through the latest stuff in Bootstrap. So we have ID equals file URL, and the class equals form control, and margin bottom of 3. And we'll self-close that. And then we have a button. And actually, you know what? Let's just copy our button up here because it's basically the same button. Only here we're going to call this download file. So same look, same spacing, everything. It's just download file. And guess what? I believe that is it. So now what we can do is we can run this application. So let's hit run, see if it runs. You never know. Here we go. And now we have our upload demo. So we choose a file, and this is from a previous video on the options pattern. Let's choose this JPEG, and we hit upload. And we get this URL right here. So if we copy this URL and paste it into the browser, we hit go. It says the specified resource does not exist, okay? Which seems to be a problem, right? Well, no, it's not a problem because that's secured. the file does not exist because we have secured that file and it cannot be downloaded directly. If we come back to our Azure and we come back over here to containers, notice there's a new container here called demo container. And in here is one file called optionspattern.jpg. And if we click it, you can actually see the URL. If you copy this, it's the same URL we already have, but it is secured. Now, if we come back over here to our container, we could change the access level from private to blob, which allows for anonymous access. Okay, we hit OK. Once that changes, we can come back over here. We can come back here to our file. We can hit refresh, and it downloads. And so now we have our file downloaded because of the fact that it allowed it. But let's go ahead and delete this. We don't want that all the time. We want that to be protected, so private, like we specified in our code, which means that now if we try and refresh this, well, wait for it because it's got to refresh. But if we were to paste it in, it's still going to do it. It actually changed the file itself, which is kind of problematic. If you reload the tab, then you no longer have access. So just know you have to do that. And hey, don't change the level of permission halfway through without thinking it through. Make sure you always secure as much as possible. So now we have our file and we cannot download it. So we go over here and hit refresh and it will not download. Not a problem. We can come over here to our file URL. We can paste it in. We can hit download file and it says no, which means we have a wire cross somewhere because it should say yes. Let's find out why. So over here, we can look at our file URL is the name of our input field. So come over here to our get file URL, and file URL is the correct name that we're asking for. So let's figure out what the difference is with our upload. Get file. It's calling get file. But it's saying that file URL is blank, even though we have a file URL right here that is the correct name. But wait, that's the ID, not the name. Name equals file URL. There we go. Forgot we have to use name because we're using a form. Let's try this again. And I already have it saved to my clipboard. So let's just paste it in rather than trying to upload again. And paste in that JPEG. I hit download file and it downloads. So now we have my file. It's the same file. It just named it 1 because I already had versions in my history. Let's go ahead and clear all download history. And now we can choose a file again to upload. We can upload this file. Notice it's going to replace it. It's going to overwrite it. But now if we grab here, we copy this, we paste this URL in, we download the file, it downloads properly. So we're using our Azure storage for upload and download with C# using a protected method, meaning the normal user cannot just paste in the URL and get that file. So if we tried to just come up here and paste that in, nope, sorry, you don't have access to that. But if you use our MVC application, they can, which means that they have to come through us for those files, which means they can't link it on their websites or other things that might cause us to have a lot of file download usage, which again, we pay for. So this way it kind of controls who has access to those files, but it allows it to upload and download files with Azure. So that's Azure Storage. That's how to use Azure Storage to store files in blob containers. That's how to protect those. That's how to access them, all while saving a lot of money. You're basically not paying for almost anything. Like I said, I think it's going to be something like between 13 and 20 cents per month, probably 13 cents or less for me because I'm uploading a few kilobytes. But even if you're uploading a gigabyte or more of data, that's not a lot, and you are still going to be paying just pennies per month for this. Again, if you have just signed up for Azure or you're in your first year, Azure Storage is free for the first year with some limitations, but you can check those out and get it for free. You also have credits for the first month you can use as well. But that's how to use it. Storage is not hard in Azure if you do it right and if you make sure that you protect yourself against making some bad choices with which options you select. You pay for what you get in the cloud. So just pay for what you are using, which means only ask for what you want. All right. So that's how you use Azure Storage. Thanks for watching. And as always, I am Tim Corey.